Welcome back. In this video, we're going to look at one of the most important questions in end times interpretation. When Jesus talks about the abomination of desolation standing in the holy place, what exactly is he talking about? And when Paul says the man of lawlessness takes his seat in the temple of God, what exactly is he talking about? What kind of mental picture do you have in your mind when we talk about these things? What are we supposed to picture? Are the passages talking about something purely spiritual? Is the holy place just the human heart? Is the temple just the church? Or are Jesus and Paul both pointing us toward a real, public, sacred space event that reveals the lawless one for what he is? And this question matters because both Matthew 24 and 2 Thessalonians chapter 2 treat the movement as a decisive sign, not a vague feeling and not a private spiritual impression, not just a slow cultural drift. It's presented by both Paul and Jesus as a recognizable event. And when Jesus says, "When you see the abomination of desolation spoken of by the prophet Daniel standing in the holy place, then those in Judea should flee." Paul says the man of lawlessness will take his seat in the temple of God, proclaiming himself to be God. So the question is simple. What kind of event would be visible enough to trigger flight, Daniel shaped enough to fulfill the abomination pattern, and theologically serious enough to be described as a self-deification in the temple of God? That's what this study's about. So here's the basic problem, and there are two key passages we need to bring together. The first is Matthew 24, verses 15 to 16, where Jesus says, "When you see the abomination of desolation spoken of by the prophet Daniel standing in the holy place, then let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains." And the second is 2 Thessalonians chapter 2, verses 3 to 4, where Paul speaks of the man of lawlessness who opposes and exalts himself against every so-called god or object of worship, and then takes his seat in the temple of God, proclaiming himself to be God. Both the passages are dealing with a final crisis, and both are connected to Daniel, and both involve sacred space, and both describe something public enough to reveal what's really happening. That's the key point. Jesus does not say, "When you privately sense something in your heart, flee Judea." And Paul doesn't just say, "The man of lawlessness will influence people spiritually." Jesus speaks of something seen, and Paul speaks of someone taking their seat in the temple of God. And that doesn't mean that every detail is easy. It doesn't mean that there are no symbolic dimensions. But it does mean we should be very cautious about reducing the passages to something more abstract, inward, or just metaphorical. So what's the holy place that Matthew 24 talks of? So let's start with Jesus' words in Matthew 24. Jesus says the abomination of desolation will stand in the holy place. The Greek phrase used is topos hagios, which means holy place or sacred place. And it's important because Matthew doesn't use the most technical word for the inner sanctuary. He uses a broader sacred site language. In other words, the holy place does not necessarily require us to identify the exact architectural spot inside of a temple structure. But it still means sacred space. It's place language, not heart language. It's not just your inner spiritual life. It points to a recognized sacred location. If Matthew wanted to say your inner spiritual life or in your heart, there's other words to use. And that matters because Jesus' instruction depends on visibility. He says, "When you see," then he immediately gives a geographic command. "Let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains." And that sequence is difficult to explain if the abomination is purely inward or individual. If the abomination is only idolatry in someone's heart, how would people see it in a way that triggers urgent, coordinated flight? And why would the response be specifically for those in Judea? Jesus doesn't say, "When this happens, everyone everywhere should search their hearts." He says, "When the visible sign appears, those in Judea should flee." And that points toward a public event, in a sacred space, connected to Jerusalem and Judea. So Matthew's phrase, "holy place," may be broad. It may not tell us exactly where the abomination stands in the inner sanctuary, or the temple precinct, or some recognizable sacred area, but it does place the event in the temple sphere. Matthew's telling us through his vocabulary that he wants us to have the temple or the idea of the temple in mind. It is a public sacrilege in a recognized sacred space. And Jesus also tells us where to look for the background. He says that the abomination of desolation spoken of by the prophet Daniel. That means we should not interpret Matthew 24 in isolation. Jesus is deliberately sending us back to Daniel. And when you go back to Daniel, the abomination language isn't vague. In Daniel, the abomination is tied to sanctuary profanation, the stopping of regular offering, and the installation or setting up of something sacrilegious. Daniel 11:31 speaks of forces profaning the temple and fortress, taking away the regular burnt offering, and setting up the abomination that makes desolate. Daniel 12:11 also connects the abomination with the removal of a regular offering. Daniel 9:27 speaks of a covenantal arrangement. Then sacrifice and offering is being stopped, and then the abomination of desolation happens. So Daniel gives us a pattern, and what we're seeing is a political or covenantal setup. Then there's a cultic or temple-related profanation. Then that profanation becomes a major turning point. And that's why Jesus' words in Matthew 24 are so significant. He's not inventing a new category. He's telling us to look back to Daniel and then invoking the Daniel category. And Daniel's category is not merely bad things happen spiritually, it's sanctuary oriented. It involves worship, sacrifice, holy space, and profanation. So now we need to turn to Paul. In 2 Thessalonians chapter 2, Paul says the day of the Lord will not come unless the rebellion comes first and the man of lawlessness is revealed. Then Paul describes the figure as one who opposes and exalts himself against every so-called God or object of worship. And then comes the central line. He takes his seat in the temple of God, proclaiming himself to be God. The Greek word Paul uses for temple is naos. That word usually points to the sanctuary proper, the dwelling place of deity, the concentrated place of divine presence. The other Greek word is hieron, which can refer more broadly to the temple complex or precincts. Paul uses naos, not hieron. That, of course, doesn't solve every question by itself, but it does matter. Paul's word choice here is more concentrated and it's more focused. He's not merely talking about the outer courts in a general way. His language evokes the sacred center, the sanctuary, the place associated with divine presence. And then Paul says that the lawless one takes his seat there. It's enthronement language. The verb idea is connected to sitting or taking a seat. The Greek verb behind this is kathizo, meaning to sit or seat oneself. So Paul's not just saying the lawless one has influence, he's describing a public act of blasphemous self-display. The man of lawlessness enters God's sacred domain, takes a seat, and proclaims himself to be God in the very place that God should be worshipped. And that's why the moment reveals him. He's not just politically powerful. He's not just religiously influential. He's making a theological claim. He's replacing God in God's own sacred space. Now, if you're still with me and you're still following along, there's going to be a question that's coming to mind. Doesn't Paul call the church the temple? Well, this is where we need to be careful, because yes, Paul does call the church the temple of God elsewhere. In 1 Corinthians 3, Paul says, "You are God's temple." In 2 Corinthians 6, he says, "We are the temple of the living God." So yeah, Paul can use temple language metaphorically for the people of God. And that means we shouldn't pretend that the church as a temple idea is illegitimate. The question is not whether Paul can use temple language metaphorically. Obviously, he can. The question is whether that is the best reading of 2 Thessalonians 2:4. And when we look at the context, a strictly church-only reading becomes difficult. Because Paul is not giving normal church identity statements here. He's not saying, "You are the temple of God, therefore live holy lives." He's narrating an eschatological event involving the man of lawlessness. The passage is about rebellion, revelation, exaltation, enthronement, and public self-deification. It sounds like an event, like a visible act. It sounds like the exact moment where the lawless one is publicly disclosed for who he is. So the church as a temple theology is real, but it doesn't automatically control the passage. Possibility is not the same as probability. Just because Paul can use naos metaphorically doesn't mean that every use of naos must be metaphorical. In 2 Thessalonians 2, the Danielic background, the enthronement language, and the public disclosure logic all push us towards a concrete sacred space event, a singular event in a singular place. And the weakest interpretation is the purely individualized one. This is the idea that the holy place or temple simply means the human heart. And there is biblical truth that the believers belong to God and are indwelt by the Spirit, and that shouldn't be denied. But that's not what Matthew 24 nor Thessalonians is describing. Jesus says when you see the abomination standing in the holy place, then those in Judea should flee. That doesn't fit an inward heart interpretation. A private spiritual condition cannot function as a public sign that Jesus describes. It can't be seen by a community in the way Matthew requires. It doesn't explain why the response is geologically limited to Judea, and it doesn't account for Daniel's sanctuary and sacrifice background. So, while personal allegiance matters deeply, Matthew 24 is not just about internal spiritual crisis. It's about a visible profanation that demands immediate response. The heart might be involved in a larger spiritual conflict, but the holy place in Matthew 24 can't be reduced to the heart. There's also the church only reading, and it's more serious than the heart only reading, in my opinion. It at least recognizes that Paul uses temple language for the people of God, but it still has problems if it becomes exclusive. If someone says the temple in 2 Thessalonians 2 must mean only the church and can't involve a concrete sacred space, well, that reading has to overcome several difficulties. First, Paul does not clearly mark the phrase as metaphorical here. In the other letters that Paul writes, when Paul says the church is God's temple, he usually makes that point directly. You are God's temple. Then he draws ethical conclusions from that. But in 2 Thessalonians 2, he doesn't say the church is the temple and the lawless one will corrupt it. He describes the man of lawlessness taking his seat in the temple of God and proclaiming himself to be God. Second, the grammar is spatial and eventive. There's movement, occupation, sitting, and proclamation. Third, Daniel's background pulls us towards sanctuary profanation. Matthew explicitly connects the abomination with Daniel, and Daniel repeatedly ties the abomination to sacrifice, sanctuary, and cultic desecration. Fourth is that Matthew's version includes Judea-specific flight. That's really hard to explain if the whole thing is only about church corruption in a general institutional sense. So, yeah, there might be broader spiritual dimensions going on here. There may be a larger allegiance crisis happening, and there may be deception within the religious structures, but the primary sign still seems to be a public sacred space profanation that's visible as a singular event. And when we put Matthew 24 and 2 Thessalonians together, the pieces start to align. Matthew gives us a sign from the perspective of Jesus' warning. When you see the abomination standing in the holy place, flee. Paul gives us the same kind of crisis from the perspective of the lawless one's self-exaltation. He takes his seat in the temple of God, proclaiming himself to be God. Matthew's language is broader, holy place. Paul's language is more concentrated, temple or naos. Matthew is emphasizing the visibility and urgency of the sign, and Paul emphasizes the theological meaning of it. Paul tells the church what this act reveals, and Matthew tells those in Judea what to do when they see it. And together they point toward a public, sacred space profanation that discloses the lawless one's true identity. It's not just political. It's not just military-based. It's not just psychological. It's a theological rebellion staged in a sacred space. The lawless one does not simply oppose God from the outside. He attempts to replace God from within the sphere associated with God's own worship. And that's why this is so serious. One of the most important ideas in this study is that the abomination functions as a disclosure event. What I mean by that is that it reveals what has been developing. The lawless one, the Antichrist, has been rising. The covenantal or political framework has been forming. The world has already been moving toward deception, but the abomination is the moment when the mask comes off. It's the visible pivot. It forces interpretation. In Matthew, that means when you see it, flee. In Paul's writing, it means this is how the man of lawlessness is revealed. The event clarifies the person. Before this moment, there just may be speculation. After this moment, the meaning is unavoidable. And that fits Daniel's pattern very well, because Daniel 9 speaks of a covenantal arrangement before the final abomination crisis. Daniel 11 and 12 connect the abomination to the stopping of the regular offering and the profaning of a sacred space. So the final crisis may involve a period where things appear politically stabilized or religiously tolerated until the decisive profanation occurs. Then everything changes. The sign is not merely that a powerful leader exists. The sign is what he does in relation to God's sacred domain. So now I need to be clear. Saying this is a public space event doesn't mean the passage has no spiritual meaning. It has massive spiritual meaning. The abomination forces allegiance. It reveals deception. It exposes the lawless one's claims. It confronts people with one question: who is God? That is why reducing the passage to just architecture would be a mistake. The issue is not just a building, but the issue is worship. The issue is replacement. The issue is the lawless one claiming divine status. Sacred space matters because of what it represents. If someone takes his seat in the temple of God and proclaims himself to be God, the location and the claim interpret each other. The space says, "This is God's domain," and the act says, "I'm taking it." The proclamation says, "I am God." That is why it's not just political occupation. It's a blasphemous enthronement. It is the visible form of theological rebellion. This really gives us helpful principle for reading prophecy. We shouldn't flatten biblical prophecy into either literalism without theology or symbolism without actual events. The Bible regularly and often gives us events that are symbolically loaded. A public event can carry deep theological meaning. A temple profanation can be a real act in a real space and also a sign of cosmic rebellion. That is often how biblical prophecy works. The Exodus plagues were real judgments, but they also revealed Yahweh's supremacy over Egypt's gods. The cross was a real historical execution, but it was also the decisive victory of God over sin, Satan, and death. The same way, the abomination of desolation can be a real public profanation, and also, at the same time, the symbolic theological unveiling of lawlessness. We don't have to choose between event and meaning. The event carries the meaning. So, to conclude, the abomination of desolation is not simply bad politics. It's not just evil in the human heart. It's not just a vague symbol for religious decline. In Matthew 24 and 2 Thessalonians 2, it is a visible, Daniel-shaped sacred space profanation that exposes the lawless one's claim to divine status. That's why Jesus said to watch for it, and why Paul treats it as the revealing of the man of lawlessness. And that's why this subject matters, because in the final crisis, deception is not only about believing the wrong political story, it's about worship and allegiance, and it is about whether the world will recognize the true God or embrace the one who enters God's sacred domain and proclaims himself to be God. The holy place and the temple shouldn't and cannot be spiritualized away. They function as the visible stage upon which the lawless one is revealed. And when that happens, according to Jesus, the time for ambiguity is over. Thank you for watching. If you know someone who needs to hear this, please share it with them. And if you haven't already, subscribe to the channel. This helps the message reach more people, and in a small but meaningful way, you're helping share God's word. So thank you for being part of that.